My name's Durais Rajali, and I'm very happy to welcome all of you to the last public policy lecture of this year. This has been quite a long year in which we have brought first a series of speakers on Latin American politics and then a series of speakers on prisons, police, and interrogation and torture in the spring. Tonight's lecture is sponsored by the Elizabeth Ducey Fund. Elizabeth Ducey was a great philanthropist. She went to Smith College in 1915. She graduated from Caitlin Gable. She lived on Sovie Island on a farm for 25 years. She was an active conservationist and gave generously to many local organizations, including Reed's Art and Music Associates, Portland Art Association, the Friends of the Columbia Gorge, and in 1953, she established the Elizabeth Ducey Fund at Reed College. Elizabeth Ducey believed deeply that a Reed education involved practical policy experience and that these two things are highly complementary. She was once in Washington, D.C., a staff assistant to Senator Richard Neuberger of Oregon, and she had a long-standing interest in socially progressive politics. When she established this fund in 1953, eventually it came to us in political science with the goal of promoting lectures on national, local, and regional affairs. Her legacy lives on not only through this lecture series, but through the Ducey internships, which we offer each year, in which we support Reed students to study at or to have practical policy experience over the summers at an NGO of their own that we will fund, and we will also buy you the ticket to go there. So those of you who are freshmen might want to remember that as time goes on. In the past series of lectures, I have repeatedly given the list of prominent people who have spoken as the public policy lecture series, and I've divided them up into three sets of people, really famous people, like Ingvar Carlsson and Medina, the ambassador, the Prime Minister of Sweden, the architect of the Oslo Peace Accords, academics, and then people whose work positions them very crucially in the major issues of our time. And today, that is the speakers. These are the speakers that I'm introducing to you. Although each of these people has important reputations on their own, it is their work as part of the research committee of the HIG that has brought them all here. I particularly would like to thank Josh Phillips, whose inspiration it was to bring together and coordinate people's rather complicated schedules and bring them all to Reed College. Let me tell you a bit about each of the speakers, and then I will pass it on to Josh Phillips. Josh will be moderating the panel. He'll talk for about 40 minutes. He'll ask questions and introduce each of this, that will introduce you to each of the speakers. And then we'll open the floor to questions. We have two young student questioners. That's Dan sitting back there. He's going to have a mic. And Theo, where are you? There you are. And he's going to have a mic. So partially because I think we record these talks, although other people can hear you, it is helpful if you had a mic so that posterity can also hear you. Let me begin with Mark Fallon. Mark Fallon began his federal law enforcement career as a deputy U.S. Marshal in 1979 when I was a sophomore at Swarthmore. And ouch. And served as a special agent with the Naval Criminal Investigative Division, NCIS, for more than 27 years. In 2008, he was appointed to the Senior Executive Service within the Department of Homeland Security. Fallon has been involved in some of the most significant counterterrorism investigation operations in U.S. history, including the attacks of 9/11, and he was appointed special agent in charge of a task force created specifically to investigate the Al-Qaeda terrorist network. He is currently director of Club Fed, providing strategic consulting services in international security matters to clients in the private, public, and sector and academic research community. He serves as chair of the U.S. government's High-Value Detainee Interrogation Group Research Committee and is the vice chair of the International Association of Chiefs of Police, Impact Executive. And, of course, all of the speakers tonight have a rather extensive media presence, which all of you could track down, I'm sure. Chris Meisner is a professor of psychology at Iowa State. He holds a PhD in cognitive and behavioral science from Florida State and conducts empirical studies on the psychological processes underlying investigative interviews, including issues surrounding eyewitness recall and identification, deception detection, and interrogations. For the last 5 years, Chris has served as a PI for an international research effort aimed at developing evidence-based methods of elicitation and interrogation in support of U.S. High-Value Detainee Interrogation Group, HIG. He has published more than 75 peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters, and his research has been funded by many important organizations: the National Science Foundation, the U.S. Department of Defense, the U.S. Department of Justice, and the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. From 2010 to 2012, he served as program director of law and social sciences at the National Science Foundation. He is the current president for the Society for Applied Research in Memory and Cognition and an elected fellow of the Association of Psychological Science and Psychonomic Society. That's 2 down, 2 more to go. Steve Kleinman has 30 years of operational and leadership experience as an intelligence officer with assignments worldwide, including for the Department of Defense Special Survival Program, Air Force Special Operations Command, and the U.S. Central Command. He's a decorated veteran of Operation Just Cause, Operation Desert Storm, Operation Iraq Freedom. Kleinman has co-authored over 24 formal papers in the areas of intelligence, the science of interrogation, the strategy of combating violent extremism. He was a senior advisor on the U.S. Intelligence Science Board's groundbreaking study on strategic interrogation and has testified as an expert witness before the Senate and House committees. He currently serves on the Science Advisory Committee for the High-Value Detainee Interrogation Group. He holds an MS in Strategic Intelligence from the National Intelligence University, an MS in Forensic Sciences from the National University, and a BA in Psychology from the University of California, Davis. He has retired from the Air Force in 2015 in the rank of full colonel. And this brings me to Josh Phillips, who, as I say, brought us together. It's rather difficult to introduce Josh for me because after all these years, I still think of him as a collaborator and a fellow walker. He gets me into more trouble than I have ever wanted to get into on my own. For one thing, he dragged me into Cambodia when I really didn't want to go, at a time when I shouldn't have been there. But it was fun. He was totally right. He is also he's recently, and perhaps most importantly, become a father, which I'm delighted in. Josh does not put in his thing here, but he is a Reed graduate, if that wasn't obvious. It was 95. I was going to say 96. And he has forgiven me for not being here in his senior year to supervise his thesis. I was on sabbatical, but we all have to make our decisions. But more importantly, Josh has gone on to a very distinguished career as a journalist. He is the author of None of Us Were Like This Before, American Soldiers and Torture, Verso 2010, which was selected as one of the top 10 books on violence for 5 books, which is an important blogosphere list. I was on that world too. Just saying. He has reported from Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and South Asia. His work has appeared in the Washington Post, Newsweek, The Nation, Salon, San Francisco Chronicle, Atlanta Journal-Constitution, among other publications. He has produced broadcast features for NPR, BBC, Al Jazeera. He won a Haywood Brown Award and the Alfred I. DuPont Columbia University Award for Excellence in Broadcast Journalism for his American Radio Works documentary, What Killed Sergeant Gray. And he is also in the news again recently because the battalion that was the subject of None of Us Were Like This Before the USCID has now opened an investigation on that case. So I will now put you in the hands. Wow, that took 10 minutes. Whew, you guys do a lot of things. So welcome to Reed. Have a conversation.
Thanks, guys, and thank you, Darius, for the terrific intros. I'm sorry I got you in so much trouble the world over.
I love every minute.
Okay, good. So,
Testimony that he's been forgiven true?
it's in deliberation. So I just thought that we would go through quick successive questions for these guys because there's a lot of ground to cover with what they've done, what they've observed. They have unique and important portals into what happened in formative stages during the War on Terror as it pertained to interrogation, especially Mark Fallon and Steve Kleinman. And Chris is an important and notable researcher into behavioral science as it pertains to interrogation. So I thought we'd first kind of sketch out and understand how we got to the point at which we linked the word interrogation with detainee abuse and torture, and how we're moving on to that today, hopefully, in trying to use science-based techniques that are ethical, that don't involve prisoner abuse and torture. So, Mark, I kind of want to start with your story, because you were at Guantanamo in 2002 during an important formative period. You were part of the Criminal Investigative Task Force there, and you got to see things play out on the ground, both in Guantanamo as they were working on interrogations, forming new policy for interrogations, and interacting with officials both in Gitmo and in DC. So why don't you give us a quick sketch of what you experienced and how you saw officials turn to or argue that we needed enhanced interrogation techniques or torture?
Yeah, sure, Josh. Happy to. If I could just go back a little before that,
Sure.
just to kind of put things into context. After the attacks of September 11th, the government made some key decisions that kind of changed the course of history, that changed the way that we had traditionally done business, that affected investigations, interrogations. And of course, on September 14th, President Bush declared a state of emergency and said that our country is in danger. And then on September 17th, he issued a finding that actually enabled the Central Intelligence Agency to take a lead role in doing interrogations, which was not a core competency of that institution. A few weeks later, on November 13th, he issued a military order giving the Department of Defense the authority to investigate the Al-Qaeda terrorist network for trials for military commission. And not a core competency of the Department of Defense to do military commissions or to be the primary investigative agency for Al-Qaeda. That order went to me. So my role and responsibility was to create a task force and to investigate the Al-Qaeda terrorist network for trials for military commission or for release or transfer or whatever, but to be the investigative arm for the Department of Defense of Al-Qaeda. Fast forward to 2002, when the controversies that involve torture were gravitating to the Department of Defense, which I think is your question. Mm-hmm. What we found was that the Department of Defense, there were a number of different task forces in play at Gitmo, JTF 170, JTF Gitmo, which was responsible for the collection of intelligence from detainees, and the CITF, which I was on, responsible for bringing detainees to justice, investigating Al-Qaeda. And the JTF Gitmo interrogators were very frustrated that they were terribly ineffective in their mission. They were not able to extract intelligence from detainees for a number of reasons. We can get into those later. I know you want short answers. It's hard to answer short some of these questions.
Sure.
But what we found was that the CIA had come to Guantanamo and were purporting the successes of EITs, which I refer to as excuses to inflict torture. I know there's some other terms that they've used, but that was my initial take and is my take today on that entire program. And so at that time, they were coming to Guantanamo and explaining how to do this. And at the time, I felt an affirmative obligation to challenge that because I felt it was in violation of the laws as I knew them. We had studied the Convention Against Torture. We had studied Nuremberg. We trained our people in that before we ever let them do an interrogation. And so from our perspective, and it was a violation of the order I had from President Bush. The order from President Bush said that the Department of Defense would interrogate anybody who is or was a member of al-Qaeda, anyone who aided or knowingly harbored the al-Qaeda terrorist network. And it also said we would treat detainees humanely. And it said we will feed them and clothe them. And that was all specified in the military order of 13 November. So I had no control over what the CIA was doing elsewhere. But when I saw the techniques coming to Guantanamo, as a senior counterterrorism official in the Department of Defense, I felt an obligation to take action to try to stop it.
So were you hearing just anecdotal stories about these successful use of EITs, enhanced interrogation techniques? Did they provide anything else as proof positive that these techniques actually produced verifiable, actionable intelligence?
Yeah, the challenge for the JTF 170 and JTF Gitmo command structure was the leaders of that task force had no interrogation experience. Neither General Dunleavy when he was down there or General Miller, who was an artillery officer when he came down. And so they were making uninformed decisions. When I was at the CITF trying to create this task force, trying to determine how to design a task force to investigate al-Qaeda for military commissions, I called in every chip I had. I asked for help. I went back to people. I created a behavioral science consulting team, and because I wanted behavioral scientists, operational psychologists I worked with for years to help me. And so part of that team actually included an operational psychologist for the CIA. And part of my network, because I had worked on the Cole Task Force before, I had worked the case on Sheikh Rahman in New York, Omar Abdel Rahman, back in the 90s. So I worked very closely with the FBI and the Joint Terrorism Task Force, so I had a lot of friends and colleagues. So I was trying to determine how to best do this. While at the same time, I had people from the CIA on my task force helping me design rapport-building techniques, the CIA turned to psychology. They outsourced it. They did not look to their internal operational psychologists. They outsourced that to two SEER psychologists who had no experience in interrogation or al-Qaeda. So the challenge for me was I was arguing with generals in the Department of Defense who were being told by the CIA these things are effective, while people from the CIA who were working with me were telling me they weren't. So I had inside information from my network about what was working and wasn't working. At the same time, the CIA was telling other commands of the effectiveness of these techniques.
Right. I mean, I'm just wondering, I want to follow up a little bit just on this notion here, because I think it's an important point. You mentioned the stories, the sort of emphatic statements that this stuff works, but they weren't providing anything. But the U.S. government has done research on interrogation. They've done, as we were discussing earlier, they've done, the CIA has themselves done research on the effects of pain and duress on memory and recall. Did they discuss any of this? Was this deliberated in any of the meetings people were having at that time about whether or not we ought to introduce torture as a component of interrogation?
No, there wasn't a lot of discussion on it, and I was not in those discussions at Langley about it at that time. I went up there and challenged them later on, but They didn't turn to their operational psychologists, but prior to 9/11, the official policy of the CIA was only to use rapport-building techniques because they were the ones that were deemed to be effective. And the CIA did have people who did interrogations, not case officers. There were polygraph operators who do interrogations in the course of those things and only use rapport-building techniques because that's what they were trained in, that's what they knew was effective. So they made policy decisions and had people who were not interrogation professionals and didn't have experience design the EITs and the techniques that were torture. And the challenge I had in trying to argue that with my experience base was the gravitas of the CIA saying they do this. Well, having worked with the CIA for years, I knew that wasn't a court. They're case officers. They're human operators. They don't do interrogations. We work with them on the Cole. They didn't do interrogations. That's not what they were trained to do. Yeah, so the challenge was trying to convince seniors who were being told, we're getting good stuff, and I was trying to argue against that groundswell but it was still classified, so they couldn't tell you how good it was. But believe me, this stuff works.
Right. Okay. Let me turn to Steve. So as Darius said in his intro, you are a seasoned interrogator who performed countless interrogations in various operations and various war theaters and so forth. Tell us a little bit about your experience in Iraq, which was also a formative time. You were there in 2003, I believe.
So the Second War, 2003. Right. At that time, I was the Department of Defense Senior Intelligence Officer for what we call Special Survival Training, which meant resistance to interrogation. And without real warning, I was asked to deploy to Iraq with a couple other individuals to help with the Special Operations Task Force on interrogation. My assumption was I was the only person there that was an experienced interrogator. Everybody else, their experience was in teaching resistance to interrogation, which they use a model of what we used to call the communist interrogation model, a very coercive, unlawful process that was designed really to get propaganda as opposed to intelligence. So I had no clue that what I was actually expected to do was go out and teach these SEER tactics, what we used to use in training to teach people to resist as a means of getting intelligence. So within 24 hours, I realized that when I walked in on some interrogations and I saw people being slapped, being threatened with iron bars, being hooded and made to stand for a prolonged period of time, sleep deprivation, just the whole litany of things that I've seen in resistance to interrogation training, which is done, I need to emphasize, done under very controlled conditions with medical personnel, psychologists watching to make sure that nobody was ever injured. It's just a highly stressful experience to the edge to see what it's like. So you can prepare that if you ever were actually captured, it clicks in some strategies how to resist. But now they were trying to, being the special ops world, the command I was assigned to, was the idea that a system that had never been, by people, as Mark said, who have never worked in an intelligence capacity, never worked against a terrorist target, were suddenly they were using these tactics. And so I need to say this. I'm a second-generation military officer. My father served in World War II, 27 years in active duty. At this point, I had, 23 years active duty. I'm a lieutenant colonel. And after a week of trying to stop these things and nobody agreeing with me, I have to say I began to think, am I missing this? I mean, I was steeped in the law of armed conflict. I knew what worked and what didn't work in interrogation. I knew my own moral compass. And so a decision had to be made, and I thought, okay, I know what the law of armed conflict requires of me. I thought I knew what the United States Air Force expected of me, but I was damn sure I knew what my father expected of me. And it's the same thing expected, I'm sure, that you would share this value. It was simply wrong. I mean, apart from the fact that operationally we can demonstrate it's not a useful way of getting intelligence. And I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to delve into those, but I think it's pretty clear that we're on unlawful ground here. But again, the immorality of it was so deep, and it was conducted by people who wore the same uniform as I did. To say it was a disturbing experience would not at all capture the gravity of it. But it was not isolated. It was systemic. It was institutionalized at the very highest level. And I'm at the point in my career, having retired, and I'm a pretty open, honest person, but I can tell you, I came back from that experience, questioned everything that I once held dear. You know, I think somebody once quoted, what I loved, I now hated, and what I hated, I now loved. It was just, and I didn't know there was a Mark Fallon out there. You know, you think you're the only one. And it wasn't until years later that our paths crossed, and I realized that I wasn't wrong, that there was a righteousness in what we were doing, and there are other people like this gentleman to my left. And you know, now we're brothers, and we shall ever be brothers for that. And it's not over. You know, it's not over. President Obama signed Executive Order 13491 on January 22nd, his second day in office, creating the Hague, stopping torture. But with all respect to the president, do you recall how he described recently the admission that we tortured folks, how he captured that? Yes, we tortured some folks. That sort of cavalier, very casual reference to torture. And if you've ever been anywhere near it, what you've seen on TV will not grab you like it does. I mean, even in a training environment where we simulate this, but when you see this, it's, who was the Supreme Court justice who talked about the definition of pornography is difficult, but I know it when I see it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Mm-hmm. Torture is the same way. I don't think we've derived a really clear, universally accepted definition of torture. I mean, what I mean by that is there are a lot of different agencies and different governments around the world will argue what it is, but you know it when you see it, and the inherent wrongness of it, if I can put it that way. It's not a very eloquent way of putting it, but the inherent wrongness of it is just manifest. So yeah, and I didn't really have a lot to argue. I could only argue based on my experience as an interrogator, but there are other people with lots of years of experience. I could argue the law of armed conflict, but there were JAG officers who would argue, you know, the contrary. Some, but it wasn't until I had a chance to start working with Dr. Christian Meisner and some of his colleagues where we began to understand the science. Why? Why does torture? Because the moral argument just didn't work. The legal argument clearly didn't work. I needed to finally turn to science and say, this is why. This is why. It's a sad place to be, but it was very real. And again, just like I bonded so deeply with Mark, Chris and I have become best friends over this shared task. And it's kind of brought sanity to my life.
So from your vantage point in Iraq at that point, what was it that changed that suddenly led operators, interrogators, to believe that torture was suddenly necessary and permissible?
That's an excellent question. And if I can leave you with any point this evening, it's this one. Why did it happen? And it goes back to science. You have the Army Field Manual, which right now, based on executive order, is the standard for interrogations by any American or representative of the American government in an armed conflict. But the question you should ask, okay, what is the proof? What is the evidence behind the approaches, the 18 strategies that are set forth in the Army Field Manual? And there is zero science. I co-wrote a paper with a couple psychologists, and we were trying to be as generous as we could. But there's no science. I can track this back to various versions, back to World War II, and it's just somebody's ideas about what might work. It's never been challenged as to its efficacy. It's never been tested under any sort of objective circumstances. But yet it's taught to generation after generation after generation. At the peak of the two wars, the Army alone was putting out 1,800 interrogators steeped in this approach, which doesn't work. Especially, it was designed for a conventional war. You have a private interrogating a private. You know, the Soviet Union coming through the Fulda Gap in the Cold War scenario, and I grew up in the Cold War. I mean, I was operational at that time. I was old enough to be there. And so some very scared Soviet Red Army corporal is probably going to say whatever, answer any question anyway, just like our young folks would as well. But they don't know anything. But now let's flash forward to the War on Terror. Think about Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. Advanced degrees, moves very seamlessly across cultures, speaks multiple languages, is comfortable and knowledgeable about American culture far more than we ever have been about his. And you're going to use a pride and ego down? You're going to humiliate him into answering questions? I think not. And so there was a war being fought. And lives were being lost on both sides. The need for intelligence was never more vital, never more critical. And it quickly became apparent that this model was not going to work. So what happened was a lot of the special operators, special forces people, had come through our school because we trained special, what they call special mission units. And they thought, you know, when I was up there in Spokane, Washington, when they were sleep depriving me and throwing me against the wall, it seemed to be pretty effective. So they started using it. Then they thought, well, why should we? Let's go get the pros. Thus, the seer community got involved, and they couldn't wait to get involved. I mean, I can tell you for a man, they couldn't wait.
Interesting.
Sadly
So, yes, sadly so, indeed. All right, so Chris, we've heard from Mark and Steve about some of the situations in Guantanamo and Iraq that led officials and operators to turn to torture. You research aspects of interrogation through a behavioral science approach. So tell us about some of the problematic ideas and beliefs about interrogation that plague interrogators and trainers for that matter, and how those beliefs can lead to problematic and even dangerous interrogation.
So, first of all, you know, as an academic, we rarely get the opportunity to work with operators. So I have to just say for the last 6-7 years, working with these two gentlemen and others on these problems has been, I think, important and incredibly productive. Not only have I learned a great deal, but the science has advanced in ways that it wouldn't have if I was in my laboratory studying these without the experts working with us. So the question is great, and it I think should be framed in a context in which Steve invoked here, essentially saying the Army Field Manual is absent any evidence supportive of its efficacy. Torture tactics, EITs, absent any evidence speaking to their efficacy. And let me just add to this, police interrogation tactics that are used here in the United States and other countries, what we might call soft, psychologically manipulative tactics that have been handed down since the Wickersham Commission. Darius could give you the history here of the evolution of this, but since the Wickersham Commission, the evolution of these psychologically based methods of interrogation, much of which is captured in the Army Field Manual, absent any evidence base to speak to their effectiveness. These methods are handed down from law enforcement or military intelligence generation to generation, and the purported effectiveness is based on their use, right? And in a confirmatory style, the extent to which I collect information or intelligence that confirms my beliefs, my intuitions, the evidence that I'm searching for, therein confirms for me the validity of these methods, right? So as we work with investigators now, we confront very strong beliefs in the efficacy of the EITs and torture and the efficacy of psychologically manipulative strategies and the efficacy of the Army Field Manual. Changing and challenging those beliefs is one of the great efforts of the past 5 years, and I dare say the next 10 or 15 years, if we're able to continue.
Well, so one of the things that I've heard you talk about and you've done research on is the negative emotional approaches. They seem to, I want you to unpack that, but sure. It seems that we have these presuppositions about what an interrogation looks like, yeah, or what it ought to look like. Yeah. There's a dynamic that we tend to think of that's reinforced and nurtured by a lot of media renditions of interrogation.
That's exactly where I was going to go. So where do all of us get our understanding of what an interrogation looks like? How many of you have been in the interrogation booth? How many of you have seen interrogation on TV or in movies? Where do we get our understanding of what an interrogation looks like? My gentleman to the right and the left of me could tell you that if you watched an interrogation, even an interrogation done today, that's done by the Army Field Manual or done by some others, it would not be a made-for-TV moment. It is not as exciting as you see on TV. It is strategic. It is long. There can be lots of pauses. It can be rather boring. It involves interpreters. Steve could embellish upon that. But our understanding, our beliefs about what happens in the interrogation room and what's effective largely comes from that that media-based understanding. Interrogators who come into Huachuca or FLETC or
These are
Quantico
the
or-
training, just to
these are
back
the-
up,
these are
the training facilities or
So
schools.
military intelligence, federal law enforcement, FBI. When interrogators come in, they bring those exact same experiences and beliefs into the training. And in fact, much of the training reinforces in some ways this notion that interrogation is an adversarial, non-cooperative interaction in which you must control the situation and ultimately achieve compliance, reaching a confession that meets with your objective and your evidence, right, if you're in a criminal context, or information that confirms an intelligence requirement that you bring into a military intelligence context. Is that effective? There's also a belief and a training that involves what we call an anxiety-based model, that in order to reach compliance, I need to manipulate your anxiety with the situation. I need to make you feel uncomfortable. I need to isolate you. And I need to also systematically manipulate your perception of the events, both current and future. And that in doing so, I will be able to achieve compliance. This is the model, essentially, that's taught, whether it's the Army Field Manual, whether it's FBI rapport-based methods, which are largely accusatorial, whether it's federal law enforcement or local law enforcement methods. The field of psychology and other fields that have studied interrogation, in fact, initially focused on the social problem of false confessions. How many of you saw Saul Kassan speak a few weeks ago? Just a few of you. So I encourage you to pick up some of Saul's work on this. Very important leading scholar on the psychology of false confessions, how false confessions occur, even with these anxiety-driven, psychologically manipulative, non-torture, soft techniques, and how they can drive innocent individuals or individuals who are innocent and don't have information to provide information that essentially validates the beliefs of the investigator. So in fact, as we were progressing towards the use of these torture tactics, there was a science essentially on false confessions, a science that said there are some problems with the methods that are even being used now. But what we lacked, being able to provide these two gentlemen and others, was a science that said these are the most productive and best ways to go. In fact, our science had not progressed to begin to ask those questions. What does rapport mean? How do you develop rapport? How do you measure it? Why is memory? Is memory important? Can memory be contaminated? How do you elicit memory in that non-cooperative initially to a hopefully cooperative state? And what are the best methods for assessing the credibility of the information that you're receiving? So those became, over time, and now particularly the past 5 years, the questions that we began to ask as social scientists.
So, Mark, Chris talked about this misplaced importance on confessions, and that seems to be one notion that has driven many interrogators, this aim to elicit a confession. What are some of the other skewed ideas or expectations that govern interrogators and that trip them up in doing effective interrogation, or may even lead them to using coercion during an interrogation?
Yeah, I think that it's probably a misperceived notion of control. I mean, confusing compliance with cooperation. If you look at the interrogation logs of Muhammad al-Qahtani at Guantanamo Bay, who was tortured, they thought they achieved a lot of success because they put panties on his head, got him to bark like a dog, or do so. They thought that was them being effective, because then the next step would be a confession. And the real key is, and I think the profession has to change from a confession mindset to an information mindset. The goal is to elicit accurate, reliable information. The goal shouldn't be a confession, because if you get it, then you might stop. So, and there's a lot of talk about an intelligence interrogation or a law enforcement interrogation. To me, there's no difference. If you talk to someone in cyber, they talk about ones and zeros. That's all data is. Well, to me, it's just information. What you want to do is elicit information from the person. How you apply it might be evidence, it might be intelligence, but what your goal ought to be is to elicit information from the individual and then apply it to whatever you need to do. So the main, and if you look at the Army Field Manual techniques, or if you look at some of the more coercive, manipulative techniques that law enforcement uses, it relies on some perception that it is control that you're trying to get and maintain control. And for me, I'd gladly give up control for information.
So, Steve, unpack this a little bit further for us. I think there are a number of things that go beyond what Chris and Mark were talking about, confession, control, and so forth. One thing that I often heard when I was interviewing interrogators or people that were involved in interrogation was the urgency of time. You know, that there was a time element that fueled the pressure that many interrogators felt and led them to believe that because of that urgency they needed to add coercion or torture to gain intelligence from their detainees. Right. What are some of the other things that trip up interrogators and their trainers for that matter?
Let me talk just a little bit about the time element, because most of the debate that you've heard over the last 10 years centers around some form of the ticking time bomb scenario, which, speaking as an intelligence officer with 32 years of experience, is a statistically improbable event. Have you ever seen one, Mark?
Nope.
I've never seen one either.
In a cartoon one time, I think.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, we're creating doctrine based on an event that is very unlikely to happen. And even if it did, it doesn't change anything. I'm not saying interrogation has the same inherent complexity as, let's say, brain surgery. But brain surgery, you can't speed it up. You can't say, you know, this is a 10-hour operation, but we only have 5, so we'll just take some shortcuts. I can imagine the behaviors that come out of that. You know, you lift up your right arm, okay, it's not going to work. And the same thing with interrogation. There's no break the glass, pull the handle, emergency, okay, we'll go to torture. We know it works, but we all think it's kind of immoral and maybe illegal, but it works. No, the science is clear that it doesn't work. There's no shortcuts. And so to know that, to try to impose an artificial, I mean, it's a real time pressure, but it's artificial in the sense of how long it takes to assess, develop, create a rapport, build bridges, resolve discord, assess credibility, and ultimately elicit useful information. You cannot push that. I mean, it's like planting a rose. You can't just go out every day and dig it up. Hey, come, there's not sprouting. And then it finally sprouts and you pull on it a little bit. It's the same sort of natural, has these natural laws that are inherent in it. And that's, I've said this before, that is called a sophisticated understanding of the craft. That's called a mature appreciation for the challenge. And that's the way you should approach it. Everything has a strength and weakness, including within intelligence collection systems. Signals intelligence may seem like it's omnipotent and omniscient, but it's not. It has limitations and it has strengths. Same thing with imagery from the sky, but also interrogations. The second part is there's a disbelief, or there's a belief within the culture of interrogation that anybody, I'm going to use the vernacular, anybody can be made to talk. Well, that part's true. I mean, any one of you can make any one of us talk, but you cannot get us to talk about what is important, what is valuable, and mostly what is truthful. And you can do a lot of things that inhibit us from either wanting to or literally capable of. You know, if you sleep deprive me for 130 hours, you're probably going to get some level of compliance. Mark mentioned this term, but you're not going to get cooperation, and certainly you're not going to get my ability to recall accurately. I mean, think about, you know, again, in a college campus, it provides such a vivid illustration. Is, you know, when you stay up those all-nighters, you know, that's always a good way to learn, isn't it? You know? Didn't work for me. Of course, I didn't realize all-nighter meant you're supposed to be reading. Nobody told me that part, but they tell me this stuff later. So it's the idea that I have we're talking about science, so I'm going to have to explain it to Dr. Meisner here because this is very sophisticated. It's a
Slowly.
formula. What's that?
Slowly.
Oh, okay, very slowly. It's called SW cubed N. And I used to try to teach that to people. Some will, some won't, so what next? I mean, some people will talk to you. You can get useful information. You know, some won't. And ultimately, you have to say, so what? Let's go on to the next one. There's never one source of information. But we would just, with our egos, with our desire for revenge, our fear, you know, those aren't excuses. Those aren't explanations. Those are our shortfalls in our character. I mean, we have professional interrogators, even after 9/11, even if you didn't know what was coming next. My brother has fought forest fires for over 40 years. And if the four of us were out making s'mores out in a campfire and it goes up, a tree's off, we have every right to run screaming from the forest. But my brother and his colleagues, they walk, they don't run, they walk, they assess, they act. Sometimes they say, we got to let it burn. Sometimes we'll go the other side, and sometimes it's a straight attack. The same thing with interrogation. The fact that we've known people who've died as a result of the war on terror. But we're not paid to have an emotion, an opinion, or have an ego about this. But we are paid to professionally walk in and talk to anybody, no matter what they've done, and use a science-based, evidence-based approach to get information. There is no shortcut to the truth, and that's the truth.
It's interesting. I remember.
I like that one. That was pretty good.
Yeah, I like the acronym. I can't remember it, but it actually reminds me of someone who I interviewed who was an interrogator at Guantanamo, and I kept hammering him about, well, what do you do about these guys that do not talk? They completely shut down. Mm-hmm. And he gave the same answer with a different acronym, but in short, he basically said, look, you just move on. Mm-hmm. You move on to the next source. But you cannot. The problem is that there's this expectation that there's one solitary source of intelligence, and you're forgetting the element that they belong to a cell.
Right.
And so therefore they cooperate, they coordinate, they trade information, and you'll find other points of access.
Right.
So.
Yeah.
So
Can I add something real quick?
yes, of course. Yeah.
Let's see. There's some people in Darius' class today. They heard me mention what is the annual budget for the United States intelligence community? Anybody here remember?
70 billion.
What's that?
70 billion.
We're very close. $75 billion a year. That's more than the United Kingdom spends on defense, and I use that to put it in proper context. So, as taxpayers, and we're all taxpayers here, are you getting a good return on your money when the safety and security of any city in the United States is dependent on whether or not we torture somebody? And what about that other $75 billion? And that's what it comes down to. We just think that, this one person has the key, and they don't. It's all part of a matrix. It's a larger calculus.
Well, that sets me up perfectly for the next transition, and I want to get to the HIG and talk about the HIG and the research and the operational element as well. But
You're welcome.
Thank you. So, Mark, tell us a little bit about the background of the HIG. How you have a role now, but you probably have more background than most of us about how it got off the ground, both in terms of its operational function, but also the research and what it's doing.
Yeah, sure, happy to, Josh. You know, one of the challenges I had when I was trying to argue with seniors about torture was the fact that there was no research available to fall back up upon. I went to my operational psychologist and I said, get me everything you have on this stuff so I can go argue. You know, at the Pentagon, I can go down to Gitmo and argue with General Miller about this stuff. And they basically said, there's really nothing out there. I mean, we have all this experience, we have a practice that we've used, but they could not pull for me research to back up my opinions. And so, as I said earlier, it got to be my opinion against the CIA's opinion that was convincing some DOD seniors what road to go down. And what's interesting came out of that, I had a psychologist who was supporting me, Dr. Robert Fine, who was on my behavioral science consulting team, who later then went to the Intelligence Science Board and did a study called Deducing Information, which really tried to look scientifically about what information was out there and really determined that, I guess 50 years was the last time, Chris, is that the accurate figure? That it's been about 50 years since the government actually did some real research into what would be an effective way to interrogate somebody. And so when President Bush took office, President Obama took office and said, we won't torture, he created a task force to look at how do we best do this, do lawful interrogations to protect the national security interests. And that task force recommended a group, which became the High Value Detainee Interrogation Group. For me, as a guy who's worked a lot of terrorism cases, that was a bit unique, but the most unique aspect of that to me was the fact that it gave it a research component, a research capability. So the concept was not only to bring together a group of individuals that were supposed to be the best trained interrogators to protect our national security interest, but also to do that, they would need the best research and the best training to accomplish that mission. So it gave, it established a unit chief for research, and a budget was created, and there's been a body of work that we're just beginning right now. And so the head of the research unit, Dr. Susan Brandon, said to herself, and probably some others, that she needed a group to consult with. And so she brought together the High Value Detainee Interrogation Group Research Committee, which Steve continues to call the Intelligence Science Board. You keep referring to the old name, but it's the HIG Research Committee, and brought together human rights people, forensic anthropologists, constitutional specialists, journalists, a number of folks, intelligence officers, people who were with the CIA, to meet quarterly and to help give some advice, guidance, to be a sounding board about the type of research that might be useful. And I know Steve and I and some of the other operational personnel, we try to put things into context of what we think might be useful for our former and current communities. So that's the unique aspect. I mean, if the HIG went away, if the operational component of the HIG went away tomorrow, there would be someone who would do those interrogations and would probably do them effectively. But if the research went away, there's no one to do the research. So that's the unique aspect of President Obama's executive order, the creation of the HIG, was not only operational capability, which we had before, but the research component of that, which we did not have, with the goal of a trickle-down effect to now take this research and then utilize it at the HIG, but then others could benefit from this research. And that's, I think, the real important work of the HIG research, is that it is merging the science and art of interrogation together. And you're finding right now in small pockets that I'm very encouraged about, you actually have the operational community, at least in federal law enforcement, embracing the researchers and making conscious decisions. And then in some of their training programs, they will only utilize validated evidence-based research in a curriculum designed for interviews and interrogations. And to take that to another, they're taking it to a whole new level, and they're actually now looking at how do we better measure the effectiveness of that training with field validation studies. And Chris can talk a little more about that, but to me, as a guy who's been responsible for some training academies, that is very encouraging. Because in an interrogation, particularly if your goal is a confession, you don't know what you left on the table. You know what you were told, but you don't know what you weren't told. So having ways to measure that more effectively to then redesign into your training programs can only improve the community.
It should be noted that there have been some high-profile cases that the HIG was involved in terms of their operational work.
According to the media.
Right. Well, so there's been the underwear bomber, I'm sorry, of I can't remember what year now. I want to say '07 or, no, it must have been later than
Abdul
that.
Farouk Abdul
Yeah, right, right.
Detroit.
Right, and now they were involved in the Boston bombing suspect.
I can't comment on the operational activities of the Hig. The media has reported some of that, however.
Okay. So, Chris, you've done a lot of interesting cutting-edge research on interrogation, and as part of that, it seems like, and we touched upon this before, but you're part of what it seems that your research has led you to is challenging certain stock notions of interrogation. And one of the schools of interrogation, the Reed method, right? As part of that, one of the things that they teach is deception detection technology. So can you talk a bit about that and what your research has shown with respect to especially how you elicit information or memory from a detainee, especially an adversarial one or a difficult one?
So there are a lot of beliefs about the cues that liars exhibit, right? And in fact, there's a study a number of years ago by a team of psychologists, social scientists around the world looking at the beliefs that people have about deception. I suspect that if I asked you, how do you tell a liar from a truth teller, I would elicit many of the same beliefs and frankly misconceptions about what differentiates one from the other. Reed and other schools, all the military academies, federal law enforcement academies that we work with, train those same beliefs and misconceptions. Let's talk about anxiety, right? Is anxiety unique in an interrogative situation to the guilty? Or might there be a reason that those who are innocent would be anxious as well? I traveled to Israel recently. On my way out of the country, I was pulled aside and asked some more questions. Turns out I had to get a new passport before I left. I didn't have enough validity on my passport. You have to have 6 months of validity now to travel to Israel and many other countries. So I have a brand new passport. I have nothing to hide. In fact, I know a lot of the questioning tactics that they're using. Right? Here I am, a very educated person being questioned in this context. I was invited by the Israeli government to visit. There's no reason that I should be anxious whatsoever, right? No reason. Yet I was.
I hope you didn't have any lint on your jacket,
Right.
because
It
then you're
just came
guilty.
off.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Is anxiety a good cue to deception? Turns out it's not. It's a good cue to being anxious in a situation, right? What about inconsistency of liars? Liars are inconsistent. You've heard that before, right? Turns out that the research suggests it's actually truth tellers that may be more likely to be inconsistent than liars. Now, why might that be? Well, it turns out that, Dan's here, memory's not perfect, right, Dan? It's not a tape recorder that you just play. Doesn't work that way. In fact, memory is a constructive process in which we have errors. Have you ever told a story before, gotten through part of the story and went, oh crap, I left out this really important part of the story? Let me go back. Or told the story a second or a third time and new details emerge? You contradict yourself? Oh no, it wasn't red, it was blue. It turns out truth tellers are more likely to be inconsistent. What are liars likely to do? Liars have a strategy of creating a story, keeping it detailed enough to maintain your interest, but yet simple enough that they don't contradict themselves. Because they know that you believe that liars are inconsistent. A lot of the research, in fact, has been showing that many of the assumptions that law enforcement, military intelligence interrogators bring to an interrogation about credibility assessment, about how to achieve a confession and cooperation to get at the truth, that their assumptions actually are the opposite of what actually works. In fact, we're doing now, Mark alluded to this, a week-long training. We've just done our 4th iteration of this, a week-long training with Air Force special investigators on science-based methods. Many of them have 20 years of experience. Some of them have 2 or 3 years of experience. They come in with these same beliefs. They've been trained in these models. In fact, we spend the first 2 days systematically dispelling many of their beliefs, receiving some challenges along the way, a lot of disbelief, until they start to use the science-based methods, which I must emphasize are the antithesis of control-based methods, anxiety-based methods. Teaching them how to develop rapport, teaching them how to be good elicitors, teaching them how to offer autonomy to the subject, teaching them how to be good listeners, teaching them how to assess credibility, teaching them how to use evidence strategically and effectively, or information, to challenge an account that you received. It's not until the 3rd, 4th, and 5th days when we start to get them to use the methods and they begin to understand the power of the methods, the effectiveness of the methods, that we start to change their attitudes. But many of the methods are, in fact, the antithesis of what they're being trained, but are being shown to be effective. Let me just also say, the research program is designed to be drawing from theory and an understanding of human behavior in that context, developing those ideas under controlled experimental conditions, including laboratory conditions, and systematically walking then that understanding out of the laboratory and into the field. We work quite a bit with federal law enforcement, military intelligence training academies. When we've developed a technique or an idea that we believe is effective, we work with those academies to design an experiment that tests out the effectiveness of that method compared to their method. In fact, this is an important process in and of itself, because those training academies still believe in the efficacy of the methods that they're training. And they haven't wholly bought into the science-based methods. But in fact, this exercise that we go through with them, where we partner with them, we collaborate them, we design a study, we pit the science-based methods against the methods that they train, we agree upon outcome measures, and we conduct the study. And by that time, they have to be bought into the results, right? They've helped to design the study, and there's an opportunity to now test out the efficacy of their methods versus the science-based methods. We've done this a handful of times. Guess who wins? Science. We wouldn't do the experiment unless we had a really good idea that we were going to succeed, right? We succeed. That process actually has bought us quite a bit of collaboration and change in the training schools. The training schools are now integrating the science-based methods into their curriculum. And in fact, they're hungry for more. I'll just end on this note. This week-long training that we're doing, Steve's one of the lead instructors for this. We get one criticism at the end of the week. Again, lots of folks with experience, they bring in their biases. You ready for the criticism? They want 2 weeks of training, not just 1 week. Because by the end of the week, they realize that we have more to offer that we can't get through in just a week. We can go deeper with the science, and the science is going to continue to evolve. I liken this, by the way, my analogy is to medicine and education, right? And how they've evolved to become more science-based, and how every year medicine and education practices evolve because we learn more about the science. Interrogation is no different. We're at the beginning of it, but we're trying to shift it over to an evidence-based process where we hope to see a continued evolution, and it's important to train the practitioners as much on the use of science and the evolution of science.
Terrific. I know we want to avail the microphones in a bit, but I have I just want to quickly ask a two-part question to the operators here that Chris has perfectly set up. I'm wondering, based on some of the new research that's come out of late, how has it fundamentally changed, or partly changed even, your notions of interrogation? How has you to rethink the work that you did, and also because you're involved in the training capacity at the Hague, or through other agencies that are benefiting from the Higgs research or the affiliates research. What are some of the toughest challenges trainers face in disabusing interrogators of some of the stock notions that they've had about interrogation, some of the problematic ideas they've had about interrogation? So either of you can go.
I'll start.
Sure. I think one of the great challenges is some of these techniques have been successful in the minds of those who've used them. So, for instance, we found, and Chris has mentioned this, I mean, there's, as the science evolves, I mean, as the science of DNA, the physical science of DNA has evolved, we have found that we have a lot of people incarcerated based on false confessions. And so before that, I mean, you would have, and I probably said in my career, an innocent person wouldn't confess to a crime they didn't commit. Well, that's wrong. And what's frightening to me is we're still training that in law enforcement. Just a few weeks back, I was talking to someone who's an instructor at Phillips, trying to encourage them to read the research and look at this. And I said that. I said, you know, years ago, I probably would have said an innocent person wouldn't confess to a crime that they didn't commit, and I don't say that anymore. And the person said, oh, I just taught that this week. So I mean, that success is challenging because people have worked 20, 25 years locking people up based on some of these things. And so they've seen or they've perceived success that is now being challenged. And that's tough to swallow. And so what I mean, when you can show them, when you can demonstrate with studies side by side, it's very powerful, particularly with the law enforcement community. And so that's why Steve and I are quite vocal advocates for merging the science and the art of interrogation and trying to advocate within our respective communities how valuable this is to our national security. Now, it's a human rights issue, it's a legal issue, but if you just forgot that and talked about our national security, and you know, I'm happy to use the case of the emir of an al-Qaeda training camp, Ibn Sheikh al-Libi, who gave information there was al-Qaeda in Iraq because of the pressure and duress he was under by another country. And that information was used by Colin Powell to take us to war. So we justified a war based on fabricated information. Ibn Sheikh al-Libi later said he just told the interrogators what they wanted to hear. So we've shed American blood, and a Secretary of State went to the United Nations with information that was fabricated by someone who was tortured. And so that jeopardizes our national security, in spite of all the other reasons. If you just look at it purely from that aspect, corrupted information is useless to the intelligence community.
I would say, you had a twofold question. First of all, I approached it as interrogator, my interrogation experience from a very, very different avenue, because I was a case officer before that. I was an agent runner, recruiting and running agents, which is a seduction. It's you find what people are interested in. It's a pulling type of process. And what the Army Field Manual and other, it's pushing, it's force, it's control, as we've mentioned. And I just, because of my experience, I just sensed that was wrong. And science has over time proved my operational hypothesis correct. But I think the biggest challenge is the same challenge that we faced in the Middle Ages when our leading scientists were convinced that the world was flat. And their status as scientists, their status in the community was based on the fact that they could prove the world was flat better than anybody else. But along comes some science to suggest, well, maybe it's not so flat. How easy is it for them to give up their status based on this now disproved knowledge? And it's the same thing. You have people whose status is based on the fact they know the Army Field Manual better than anybody else. How quickly are they say, oh, I'll go to the back of the class, we'll start over again? I mean, I'm a human intelligence officer. I need to be able to establish rapport, to be able to understand what somebody's interests are, and hopefully lead them towards the truth. For me to pay no attention to that when I'm dealing now with bureaucrats, people, again, whose status, it's the same thing trying to say, You know, a religious argument when you're interrogating somebody, oh, your religious beliefs don't make any sense, let me show you why. That's silly. Yeah, that's just folly from the beginning. I have to use that same rapport-based, adaptable, accommodating, autonomous approach to these people and get past them. Can you just step aside? Because we're getting, as Chris mentioned, a lot of buy-in, a lot of really enthusiastic buy-in by the next generation who have already seen that what they taught me is not working. But what you guys are suggesting is a whole different, and I know I speak for my colleagues here, when we say what we're teaching, it's not us. You know, it's not we are right, but what I believe we are teaching is right. And we just happen to be associated with it. And we have science, we have operational experience to back up every one of our arguments. And we're not just sitting here saying because Mark's done 30 years or I've done 30 years, it's right. We can give you objective arguments, but it is right on operationally, it's right legally, it's right morally. And I think that's a pretty good deal.
Well, thank you so much. You said integration takes time.
Right, right. So, should we turn it over to a question?
First we want
Oh, sure.
Never stop and never applaud. They're acting.
Given that we have about 20 minutes, my suggestion
Okay.
is that you field your own questions and take more than one question, like take 3 or 4 questions and handle them
Okay.
as a group, because there's more of you guys.
Yeah.
So, Dan, Theo, where have you gone? Dan over there, and, okay, well, you're in charge.
Oh, anarchy rules now.
Doesn't look like it.
So is the microphone working? Okay. I mean, the enterprise you're describing is, deeply encouraging and in many ways exciting, but let me explore a perhaps skeptical tone. Several of you, several times, pointed out that the science is evolving, and that's certainly consistent with my impression that many of the specific interview techniques that are being developed for detection of deception are published in the last 8-9 years. There's refinements coming out. And so the question, I guess, is, are we confident that these specific interviewing techniques are ready for export? Is it possible that we are setting up complicated training regimens and a year or two we're going to say, oops, we need a refinement, or oops, we need something that's even better? Is it possible that even though there's a need to move forward quickly, we might be moving forward too quickly in ways that might perhaps compromise efficacy or maybe compromise the credibility of these efforts with the intelligence community?
And we'll just take a few more. So, yeah.
Well, mine's completely different. I'm curious about women interrogators, your experiences with them, observations of them. I have my own conclusions that I'm drawing based on your comments, and I'm curious about that.
And one more. Yeah, there you
The question directed primarily to Mr. Fallon, Mr. Kleinman. You have between you nearly 50 years of operational experience, and you have reported that you have never seen what is known by shorthand as the ticking bomb scenario. That's a very striking statement, because everything that we read about in more or less responsible discussions of the ethics of interrogations, pro-torture, con-torture, et cetera, everything seems to be predicated upon efficacy, real or imagined, in the ticking bomb scenario. And if that linchpin of ethical questioning simply doesn't exist, it really does, and I'm a stranger to this world, but I've thought about it for many years. It really does make you reassess your complete approach to hostile interrogation. No ticking bomb in 50 years. That's a pretty striking statement.
You want to take that first? Academic?
Do you want me to address Dan's
Yeah,
question?
take the first
so
one for
Dan,
sure.
I resonate to your question. It's a really important question. How quickly do you push out the research? How quickly do you hold it up as gold standard? I don't know if you're familiar with Russ Whitehurst and what he's done in education, setting up the What Works Clearinghouse. I encourage anybody to take a look at that process that Russ has set up for the called IES, Institute for Education Sciences, which is a wing of the Department of Education. This is a conversation that I often have with Susan Brandon and these gentlemen and others about when is it ready for prime time? When is it likely? When do we have enough evidence? I'm skeptical, as you are, that I want to have a firm evidence base before I start to advocate for these things. In many cases, the techniques that we're training, for example, with the Air Force, are based on things like the cognitive interview, which has 30 years of experience of research base and very large effect sizes, right? In other cases with the credibility assessment stuff, it's based on now meta-analyses of hundreds of studies in some cases and less so in others.
Motivational interviewing?
Motivational interviewing, of course, has its own research base that we're drawing on from other literatures, but it's a fairly strong base, evidence-based base. I'll just give one more example if I can remember it. Well, I'm not going to remember it right now. It's in the back of my mind. But I resonate to what you're saying. And the other thing that we try to do when we train is to talk about, to educate interrogators to some extent on science as probabilistic, right? I think they're often trained with interrogation techniques and with the mindset, though, if you do X, Y will causally be produced, right? And it's highly likely that you'll achieve this outcome. When we talk about the techniques, we talk about it in a probabilistic sense. This use of this approach is likely to increase your odds of achieving an objective, but by no means are they perfect. By no means do they work all of the time. So part of, and we do some education about the evolution of science, that this is something that will continue to evolve. I don't have an answer for your question. It's debated among us, debated within the HIG. There are wonderful models that Russ Whitehurst and others have set up for how to move things forward. The NIH model and translational research, taking basic science to practice, is another model that we often talk about and evoke in this context. It's an issue that we continue to confront.
Mm-hmm. And it will, you mentioned about oops, might need refinement. Actually, we'll delete the oops. Whatever model that we have, if it's truly evidence-based, it will be continually refined. Because unfortunately, as we've mentioned, interrogation today is not informed by the dramatic leaps forward in our understanding of human behavior since World War II. But the Army Field Manual just completely ignorant of it. But what we know in 2015 will probably pale in comparison to 2020 and 2025, and those should be incorporated into how we approach this. You want to, I'll take the question about the female interrogators. You want to do the ticking time on? Yeah, it's funny how often we get that question, and I'm glad for it, because I don't think interrogators should be young people. You know, we have 18, 19-year-olds in the Army and the Marine Corps doing that. It's just too much pressure, too much expectation, too much responsibility. And the other problem is they're largely male. And for the men in the room, remember back when you're 18 years old and you get frustrated, do you think about, now what philosophical construct shall I turn to try to understand the best possible avenue? No, I mean, it's like you get frustrated and there's a physicality element, or at least a desire. And then there's some real world pressures. Sometimes you have these young interrogators, and I mean, this is very serious. One of their friends, one of their colleagues, somebody they went through basic with, was literally killed, possibly by the person sitting in front of them. That's difficult. Now, the other part, we talked about it in Dryas's class today. One quality that I've heard from some of the best interrogators I've ever directly interviewed or studied historical figures, the quality is empathy. And I hope I don't sound, I hope there's a science base to it and I'm not being culturally inappropriate. But I think women, I don't know if it's a natural gravitation towards that or our culture teaches it, whatever. I think perhaps we'd all, at least majority, agree that women, I think, have it over men in terms of empathy. Men can learn this, very much so. But I think to be able to connect and understand and just sit back and reflect, the patience and things like that. There's so many qualities that we ascribe to the feminine spirit that we don't to the masculine spirit are so valuable in our model of interrogation. And so even in Desert Storm, we're going to interrogate people from Arabic culture. They don't have to talk to women. I said, okay, well, just sign all your female interrogators to my team, and watch us go. And we did. You know, it was a whole different dynamic. So, and it's also when you're looking to. This is my theory. When you look to recruit interrogators, you look for two categories. One, people who are interested in it, and some people who say, I would never do that in a million years. Because you want some passion for it, but then you find out maybe too much. But then people, I'd never do that. Well, let me explain. This is what interrogation is. It's a systematic questioning of an individual that you believe, based on objective grounds, has information of law enforcement or intelligence value. And in instances where they show a resistance, you use principles of suasion, which in a moral argument, that term means persuasion in the absence of coercion. Did you hear me talk about force? Did you hear me talk about anger, loud music? No. It's just, how do you systematically question somebody, elicit information? And certainly female interrogators are able to perform at the highest possible levels. So, I have a new career for you.
We have very little data on this question, but we do have some data suggesting that female interrogators are more likely to go towards rapport-based methods, positive emotional approaches, for example, in the Army Field Manual.
Mm-hmm.
And in that way, they may be more effective because those methods tend to produce more information of intelligence value, as opposed to the kind of anxiety-driven model that we've often talked about. So there's some indirect evidence that they may be using the most appropriate or the most effective methods.
And I just want to reinforce what both of Steve and Chris had said. At the CITF, when we were matching interrogators who were going to talk to suspects, we were concerned with matching some of the females early on. And I was concerned with selecting. I had the luxury of handpicking some folks. And what I found was, as I looked back, some of our better interrogators were the female interrogators. They did a phenomenal job, and I quickly changed my opinion. I was concerned for them, whether they would be successful, and they alleviated all fears and showed me that they were some of the most successful in the interrogations. Now to talk about the ticking time bomb theory, that's one that Chris talked about when he got pulled over, he started to flutter. That almost angers me, that argument from people, because there's a predisposition that torture works. So that's why you would use it in the ticking time bomb theories. So, you know, for those who continued the Dershowitzes of the world and those who would argue that it might be necessary to save lives, that is because you're coming from a frame of reference that the torture would actually produce good information. So if you change your frame of reference to that torture might produce fabricated or false information, would you still argue to do that? Would you want to get bad information more quickly? I agree with you. That's what's used constantly in why we need to do that, absent of any evidence that would show that it actually result in accurate information, if that scenario ever did exist or might exist in the future.
Yeah. Scare tactic. Excuse me.
I should just quickly make a plug here that Darius's book actually shows the first documented case of the ticking time bomb story, which, spoiler alert, is not based on an actual incident, but a work of fiction.
Yeah, it comes out of a novel called Les Julian. It was written by a war journalist from France in 1961. That's the story.
Do we have more questions?
Well, we got two more. We got
Okay.
one mic there, one mic there. So
All right.
down, then up, and then what happens?
Okay.
So from a public policy perspective, one of the things that I think right-thinking people would want to do is say, how do we avoid ending up where we ended up shortly after 9/11, which is with these kind of torture techniques to try and gain information. And your description of how it happened is particularly alarming from that perspective, I think, and so I want to confirm that it's really, that there was nothing else to it. It sounds like Keystone Cops, uneducated people, incompetent, with wrong beliefs, wandering around, trying to kind of like do the best they could, and that's how it happened. And I say it's disturbing because if there was a sort of an intentional mastermind behind it, right? who wanted it to happen that way, then you could guard against that, with a policy that creates checks and balances or something of that nature. But if it's really a Keystone Cops type situation, I mean, what do we do?
Yeah.
One more. Let's get the other one.
Okay, I've got just a couple comments and.
Well, let's try to keep it to just
Yeah,
a question.
it'll be
'cause we're
brief.
really tight on time.
Steve, I thought early on you said that when you went over to Iraq, suddenly you found yourself teaching communist interrogation techniques. Did I hear that right? That's the first
No.
question.
No.
And
You didn't hear it right.
oh, I didn't hear it.
No.
And then moving on, I mean, it's having been a person who's been involved in the politics of Latin America from the 80s on, torture has been used extensively in Latin America, and it's never been about information. It's always been about terror. And in the Middle East, we see ourselves moving in, and I guess my question to the panel then would be, what is the involvement in Israel in promoting the idea of torturing Arabs? And because you're right, why would we want to do that? Ethically, morally, or any other reason, the people of the Middle East are our friends. So it makes no sense whatsoever.
Let me, actually, I just want to answer or touch upon the first question, because this is a product of some of my work. And as a journalist that was trying to understand how U.S. forces turned to torture, how U.S. policymakers thought of these ideas as necessary and effective, one of the questions I kept raising and trying to answer through the work that I did was, well, okay, surely there must be a study, some data, any kind of empirical evidence that this stuff produced verifiable, actionable intelligence. And it's incredible that there is nothing out there. I mean, that is really just kind of outrageous to me, that there's not a study that they could summon, that they could reference at all. But let you guys talk further about that.
Well, I was going to say, I don't think the Keystone Cops are deserving of your dismissive. Seriously, I think my testimony, both Mark and I testified separately before the Senate Armed Services Committee, and I made the statement that the single point of failure in all this was the lack of a knowledgeable, sophisticated understanding at the senior level. I mean, people make decisions about, I'll stay within my field of intelligence, about technical intelligence based on science, whether it's signals intelligence or imagery. But anybody off the street is an expert on interrogation because they've seen it. And it's not just people on the street, but it's senior officials within your government who argue for a way of interrogation without any premise, without any evidence for it. And so I call it the tyranny of the dilettante. I mean, you have people just flittering around from senior position to senior position, and by virtue of the fact they're in the position, they're imbued with the knowledge. That doesn't happen. That just doesn't happen. Here's a question. Who here thinks that the older Nodong system in North Korea, do you think it's propulsion or telemetry that gives them the most problem in getting an intercontinental ballistic missile system in place? Anybody? That's the same, and forgive me, I'm just using this example. That's your same level of understanding of interrogation, and that's the same level, the difference. Not knowing, but yet people are in position to say, no, we need to do this. So it is, I think the Keystone Cops knew what they were doing. I mean, they were planning on entertaining, and they did. But, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm happy to comment on it because I share your concern and I perceive your frustration about how little went into this. When Jonathan Fredman from the CIA Office of General Counsel went to Guantanamo and explained these techniques, and we took notes of those, and I wrote an email that became my most prolific writing. I should have spell checked it better, but Senator Carl Levin read this email that I wrote back to my staff, where when he opened up the Senate Armed Services Committee, I said, somebody needs to be looking how history will look back on this. I was so shocked at what we were going, the road we were going down. And I think when history looks back, they will look back at the single most damaging decision that we made post 9/11 was that decision to torture. Because that created a process of military commissions that is failed time and time again, that is a flawed process that was created to hide torture. It is created, even if you look at the CIA getting a mission, if you look at how terribly they executed that mission, it's just frightening. It's frightening. The countries that house black sites are known. The RDI program, if you read the executive summary of the torture report, I am surprised, and it's probably because of the Republican control of Congress, that there is not more calls for some reforms within the Central Intelligence Agency based on the manner in which they executed their mission that they got to interrogate detainees. And if you look at how that has unraveled and the way they executed that program, it was disastrous to our national security. I am convinced that had we let interrogation professionals conduct interrogation of the Al-Qaeda suspects, we would have got actionable intelligence. And I don't have the proof to do that. And John Brennan said it is unknowable. Well, it might be unknowable that I could beat a professional tennis player in a tennis match, although I don't play tennis as a professional. They do, but I haven't played, so it is unknowable that Tom Brady can throw a football better than I can throw it. That's an unknowable fact because I haven't tried to do it with Tom Brady. He's a professional, and he can probably do it better than me. So if you were going to bet, I would probably bet on the professional. Well, the administration did not bet on professionals to do that. And so that decision to torture has left us with what we have today. We continue to try to classify and redact our way out of our past mistakes. And at some point, we're signatories to the Convention Against Torture, and we violated laws. It's clear. So at some point as a nation, we are going to have to reconcile with the mistakes we made and move forward with a decision that we will never make these mistakes again. And the decision not to torture is an executive order from the president. So the concerns that I think all of us sitting before you here today share is the fact that if a bombing occurred at a school in Portland, Oregon tomorrow, God forbid, there will be calls for torture. Darius has studies about what people perceive works and doesn't work, but we're an attack away from going back to the mistakes we made in the past, which jeopardize our national security. They make us less safe. They're dangerous.
Oh, yes. The point I was trying to make, and perhaps I fumbled in making it, but we were teaching this, what was called within the United States government the communist interrogation model. Why? Because it was based on studies of North Korea, Soviets during the show trials, North Vietnamese. This very coercive form of interrogation was designed primarily to get propaganda. And we described it as immoral and illegal and as torture. We didn't mince words on that. But yet suddenly, when the forces of democracy embraced it, it became enhanced. I don't quite understand that yet. I got the thesaurus out, I got the dictionary, it just didn't quite work. So forgive me if
you were
I...
training it in a resistance context.
Yeah, we were training, and that's what they called it, right? And then that was taken out of that very controlled environment and used.
This is sincere training.
This is sincere training,
right? The survival, evasion, resistance,
right,
escape training.
Thank you. Right. Clearly, I'll bring an interpreter with me next time. So.
Speaking of which, next time, hopefully, we are at 5. They need 25 minutes to set up the room.
Okay.
I want to thank you again for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well done.